Hey, so welcome everybody. We still have a few people arriving and people can trickle in over the next few minutes, but good evening and welcome to session 3 of the Global Birthday event for the Institute of Historical Research, the IHR, which was founded on the 8th of July, 100 years ago. The IHR, as I'm sure you know, is the UK's National Centre for History, supporting and promoting historical research and practice wherever they're found. But today is really demonstrating the global reach and importance of the IHR's work as well. It's lovely to see you if you're joining your first session of the day, and welcome back if you've been with us since this morning as we've travelled across the globe from Australia and Southeast Asia this morning to Africa and the Middle East, and now over to Europe and the Americas. I'm Catherine Clark. I'm a professor at the IHR and director of our Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. We're home to all kinds of projects, including the Victoria County History, which is actually even older than the IHR, but it's been based at the Institute since 1933. And today it's co-produced with communities across England, as well as the crowdsourced digital history project, Layers of London, and lots more. It's a real privilege to have been invited to chair this session with our panel of very distinguished speakers. First of all, some very quick housekeeping. Please can I ask that you keep your microphone on mute if you're not speaking, but do please leave your camera on. It's lovely to see that many of you have, if you're comfortable with that, and if you have the bandwidth, because it's lovely to see the faces in the room. This is our birthday party after all. Please do be aware if you're on camera that the event is being recorded. Please keep the chat box open. It's a really good way to keep in touch with information messages, and we'd also really love to see your comments and thoughts and engagement in the chat throughout the event. I hope that later on there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions as part of the discussion. You'll be able to do that either in the chat or by raising your hand using the Zoom function. Please can I just ask that you don't put questions into the chat until I invite them a bit more formally later on, in case they get lost in the thread in the chat. And finally, if you're that way inclined, it would be great if you could tweet your thoughts and live tweet along with this session so we can share with those who are not in the virtual room. Please use our handle at IHR_history or our hashtag #OurCentury. So here's a rough plan for the event. It's going to be informal, I hope. I hope we'll see a really nice conversation between us all emerging organically. We'll begin with a short message from one of our IHR Centenary patrons. Then I'll introduce our wonderful panel, who'll each offer a few thoughts on history in their context today, as well as the future of history. There'll be some time for discussion and questions, followed by another patron's message. Then I'm really delighted to say that we're joined by Professor Claire Langemer, incoming director of the IHR, and she'll be able to share some closing words. I'm looking forward to some thoughtful and rigorous discussion about history now and in the future, but it is also a birthday party. So like me, I'd encourage you to have a glass of something to hand as well. So I'm delighted now to introduce a short video message from one of our IHR Centenary patrons, and all these messages will be available for you to watch after today. This one is from Sir David Cannadine.
Hello, I'm David Cannadine, currently based at Princeton University here in the United States, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to convey transatlantic congratulations to the Institute of Historical Research on the 100th anniversary of its foundation by Professor A.F. Pollard, and as marked by its formal opening, which took place on the 9th of July, 1921. And I offer these birthday greetings with a special fondness and warmth and friendship and appreciation. Since I was myself director of the IHR from 1998 to 2003, I retained a close connection with it for another 5 years as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother Professor of British History. And I remain an ardent and admiring supporter of what it is, what it does, and what it stands for. I also note that the speaker at that opening ceremony was H.A.L. Fisher, who was president of the Board of Education in Lloyd George's coalition government, and himself a distinguished academic who would produce his most famous work, A Multi-Volume History of Europe, in 1935. Also present on that occasion was James Bryce, another famous scholar and public figure who had written a history of the Holy Roman Empire, held office in Gladstone's last two Liberal governments, and later served as British ambassador to the United States. Bryce had previously been president of the British Academy. Fisher would hold the same office, and by a remarkable coincidence, I'm the current president today, which enables me to bring presidential as well as personal greetings on the occasion of this great anniversary. When Pollard founded the IHR 100 years ago, academic history was very much a niche subject, largely confined to the universities of London, Oxford, Cambridge, and Manchester, preoccupied with constitutional, political, and diplomatic aspects of the past, and mainly the province of men rather than women. A century later, the many roads to the past now encompass economic, social, intellectual, cultural, women's, gender, ethnic, and global histories. The subject is taught in universities across the whole of the United Kingdom. Many of its most distinguished practitioners are women or come from what are termed ethnic minorities. And history is no longer the exclusive domain of dry as dust, but is an essential and thus a contested part of our broader national culture and national life. These are very significant changes since Pollard's day. And as the practice of history has evolved and broadened and developed across the last 100 years, the IHR has itself been both the beneficiary and in no small part the agent of these many and manifold changes. When I served as director, we tried to push things forward and along a little bit more, raising unprecedented amounts of money, increasing the IHR's public profile and engagement, embracing the beginnings of the IT revolution, and making a start at fixing our building. It was a very exciting place to be and a very exciting time, which I'm told is still fondly remembered in certain quarters. This centenary is a great opportunity to take stock of where the IHR has been and what it has done, and to rethink and to repurpose it for the next 100 years. If A.F. Pollard were alive today, what would he want the IHR to be doing and to be here and now? That's the challenging and exciting question it faces. And it's a challenge and an opportunity to which I'm sure it will rise and will do so brilliantly and imaginatively. May the IHR's second century be every bit as creative and important as its first 100 years that we rightly celebrate and acclaim today. Happy birthday. May there be many more of them. Huge congratulations and hurrah and bravo.
Hurrah and bravo indeed. Happy birthday. And it's great to be reminded through David's words of Pollard's original vision for the IHR as a laboratory for experimental and innovative new ways of doing history, which I hope is a tradition that we cherish here in the IHR. But of course, our centenary is an opportunity to open up beyond the IHR and to celebrate and reflect on history much more broadly as a field, as a discipline, as a practice over the last century, today, and into the future as well. And that's the conversation that we're going to have together now. So we're going to move on to our panel discussion, joined by distinguished speakers from Europe and North America. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists in turn, and they're going to offer just very short starting points just to stimulate our discussion and get us off the ground. So first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Bernhard Rieger, Professor of European History at the Institute for History, Leiden University. Bernhard's research places European history since the 19th century in global contexts and examines how humankind has dramatically reshaped the natural, social, and political worlds over the last century. He's currently on the editorial board for the IHR's journal with Oxford University Press, Historical Research. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Bernhard. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Happy birthday, IHR. Very nice to see David Cannadine. He was actually the examiner of my PhD when he was the director of the IHR. And that basically takes me to something which I hope that the IHR can preserve, and that is when I arrived in '95 as a young PhD student from Germany, I had never come across an institution like this, so open, with the many seminars where you can go to dinner afterwards, where you can meet people from all over the world. It was a true education. Suddenly I was meeting the people that I had read. And it's this is obviously for the IHR difficult to maintain. One of the things that worked very well was that people still live rather close to the IHR in central London. Now they're much more scattered. So many challenges here also for Claire Langemer. But I think it's a very important institution for the PhD students. It's a center for people that are scattered all over London. It's a meeting point. And it has remained this. So when we talk about challenges, I think I want to say two things. So I'm a German who works in the Netherlands, and what I'm seeing as a real challenge is that in the last 30 years, there's really been a democratization of history and also an internationalization of history as a discipline. And the last 10 years since the financial crisis has really started moving in a different direction. You get a research in German right, questioning the memory culture surrounding the Holocaust and the Third Reich. And you have very strong memory wars surrounding the colonial past, for instance, in the Netherlands. So I think, I think like the IHR is very well placed, I hope, to keep to remain an international institution where people can pursue these kinds of debates. But I think like with the borders becoming more pronounced, and not just because of this COVID crisis, but also when you look at it from a continental European point of view, it will become more difficult to come to Britain. I think this would be a great thing to do for the IHR to try and work actively against this. That's it.
Thank you so much, Bernhard. Well, a wonderful kind of succinct, but provocative and challenging way to get us started. I'm sure we're going to come back to some of those issues around political contexts, memory wars, Brexit, some of the things you've touched on there. Thank you. So I'll introduce our next panelist, who is Professor Amanda Herbert, Associate Director at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, DC. Amanda is a historian of the body, gender and sexuality, medicine and health, food and drink. And among many other things right now, she's currently co-director of the major Mellon-funded research project, Before Farm to Table, Early Modern Foodways and Cultures. And she's a board member of the American Friends of the IHR. So thanks for joining us, Amanda, and over to you.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues, as it has been throughout this whole year of IHR, or year plus of IHR programming during COVID. In my capacity as a member of the American Friends of the IHR, I just want to say how grateful we are for this long-standing relationship. I know Newton's going to speak a little bit more about that too, but it was something that I felt very keenly during COVID. What had been a treat to get to go and connect with colleagues at the IHR maybe once or twice a year as someone who lived in North America became something that was now suddenly part of my everyday life during COVID, that I could attend seminars. And so that was a really wonderful sense of connection and very meaningful to me at a time of great isolation for all of us. I wanted to, in my capacity as Associate Director for Fellowships at the Folger Institute, speak just a little bit in my 2 minutes remaining about some of the ways that I've seen history grow in the last 5 or so years, And I've seen it as a moment of rich, multi-directional engagement between formally trained practitioners of history, historical practitioners really of all kinds, and members of the public who thought that they didn't really love history that much, but then fell in love with our discipline as they came into contact with our project. So as you very kindly mentioned, I'm co-director of a 4-year, $1.5 million project sponsored by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation called Before Farm to Table, Early Modern Foodways and Cultures. And over the last 4 years, we've been doing a lot of public-facing work to get people to think about the historical foodways, inequities, pathways of early modern food and how it could affect the modern foodways, pathways, and inequities that we see in the way that we eat and drink today. One of the most exciting things that we've done is engage with historical interpreters, activists, and award-winning authors like Michael W. Twitty, the author of The Cooking Gene, a phenomenal book that I encourage everyone to take a look at. Whether or not you think you are a historian of food, this book will have something for you. Michael gave lectures at the Folger pre-COVID, and then he worked with us to develop recipes that were evocative of and reflective of the experiences of people who had been enslaved in North America during the 17th and 18th centuries. We found that people from around the country, around the world, saw this as a real touch point, a place where they could get a sense of the past, learn about people who have been elided or erased from the historical record, and help set the historical record straight. So that's where I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And it's really great to hear how you value being able to connect with the IHR over this, really strange and difficult past year. And I think we've all felt in the IHR and with our friends and communities that despite all the challenges and the difficulties and the sadnesses over the last year, expanding what we do online, finding those new ways of connecting with historians in different communities and different geographical places and strengthening our international networks has been a real positive, and hopefully we'll be taking forward some of the positives of that into the future when we get back to some kind of new normal as well. Thank you, Amanda. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Newton Key, Distinguished History Professor Emeritus at Eastern Illinois University. His research focuses on early modern England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and he's currently Vice President of the American Friends of the IHR. Welcome, Newton, and over to you.
Thank you, and happy birthday, IHR. As Amanda said, the American Friends has existed since I think 1989, and then I joined in the 1998, I believe, and it's been a chance to sort of find out what's going on each year at the IHR and how things have changed. I'm going to start with two sort of memories of my own of the IHR and relate those to challenges and the future there. And the first is actually getting into the IHR back in, I think, 1979. As Jacqueline Eels was pointing out on Twitter today, that when she joined in 1970, or first got in there in 1973, it was closer to the 50th as opposed to the 100th. So this is a while ago. But I was neither. I was between being an undergraduate and a postgraduate. I had a letter from my undergraduate supervisor saying that I was an okay person. They weren't sure what to do. I think I talked to the director eventually. He looked out in the out the window for a while, and finally I realized, well, there would be some sort of charge. And when I realized it was about £5, I said, I think I can pay that, and I got in. And it was very exciting to get in, and for some of the things that Bernhard said in terms of seeing the people at seminars and so on that you had read and so on. This relates a little bit to the present in terms of the last time I was there. It was exciting to see like all the tables filled and so on. And I think Joe Fox had sort of pushed through, maybe it was before her, in terms of eliminating some of those fees for students to get in and so on. And that's an exciting change there. As a graduate student, I came back, was using the IHR and also going to the seminars. I think it was one run by John Miller, Ian Roy, and Henry Roseveare. And they started always with sort of going around and asking you what sort of research questions you have before some great speaker there. And that seems like a little thing, but one of the answers to one of those led to several articles I wrote, actually on fees, Amanda, so which is not my dissertation research. So that relates to the present in terms of the response to the pandemic, that we've been doing these things online, and so you can actually join the seminars, and that's quite exciting, especially for those of us that are more far-flung or not at R1 universities and so on. In the future, from my own work until a month ago as director of faculty development, I'm very interested in learning spaces. And if we can sort of take that idea of the laboratory that David Cannadine was reminding us is the original idea, and sort of say, what's the way to sort of merge that in-person learning space with this online world, and that's exciting, but it's also difficult. I think that we did the move to Zoom or whatever quite well, but then how do we get that back to here is some primary sources in front of you, how do you work with those, and so on. So that's mainly what I wanted to say in terms of some of the things that have gone on in the last decade or so, like history labs and so on. There's been some exciting pedagogical ideas coming out of the IHR, as well as the sort of research laboratory stuff that they have always been famous for. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Newton. And that seems a wonderfully kind of timely rethinking of the idea of the history laboratory. Thanks so much for calling attention to that, how we can be guided by that principle of being a history laboratory, thinking in experimental and innovative ways about doing history in this kind of post or with COVID era, as we start to think about new ways of doing teaching and learning and engagement in blended and hybrid and online and virtual spaces. Really, really exciting. I hope we'll be able to come back to some conversation around that. Thanks. Our next speaker is Professor Douglas Peers, who is Dean Emeritus for History at the University of Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Douglas's research and teaching interests include the British Empire, India since 1700, Britain since 1750, and transnational and global histories. Douglas has been involved in the creation of the Canadian Friends of the IHR. It's lovely to have you with us, Douglas. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And again, thanks to everybody for this great opportunity to celebrate the IHR. When I was thinking about this morning, I was reminded of a comment by a colleague during the time I was doing my PhD, actually a colleague who might well be in this audience, who observed to my wife in 1988 that he was surprised I actually managed to finish my thesis because I spent all my time in the tea room at the IHR. I would actually, on reflection, say that in fact, it was the tea room that actually helped me to complete my dissertation. The tea room combined with the seminars created a remarkably unique community that exposed you not simply to your own thoughts, your own research, but to what others were doing. It was a you know, maybe the 80s were particularly exciting, but nevertheless, I think, and most people I've spoken to found that having the opportunity to spend time at the IHR, meeting other people of different generations, different backgrounds, different schools and methodologies, was remarkably unique. And one of the reasons for a bunch of us coming together to try and create the Canadian Friends is to look at ways in which we can try and sustain that, creating that sense of community. I would add that the pandemic has made that the importance of community that much stronger. But I would also think that one of the lessons we've learned from the pandemic is how quickly we've learned to develop other forms of community, and particularly the way in which the virtual networks can make it accessible to other groups. Because, you know, I'm the first to admit I was a relatively privileged white middle-class male going off to do a PhD, and there are a lot of people who didn't have that opportunity. Now with the virtual networks, I would think that places like the IHR could become more plugged in more broadly. But I think more broadly, what I would like to say just a little bit about, and again, listening a bit to the conversations this morning and some of the sessions, is to think about where history currently stands. I'm using the vantage point of Canada, because in many ways we're in a rather unique situation as historians. I can't speak for the enrollment numbers in the UK, but as a dean, I obsessed about enrollments in my 15 years of administration. And we saw over those 15 years what appeared to be a general decline, at least in the terms of the numbers of students who were choosing to major in history. I'm speaking mainly here of Canada. There was some variation between universities, but overall, well, a lot of students would still choose a history elective or an optional course. History as a major was on decline, like it wasn't too much of the humanities. But that was kind of, at the same time we saw that, there's this huge surge of popular engagement with history, leading a lot of us to try and wrestle with how is it that we have this huge commitment and interest in history, whether it's the heritage industry, whether it's history programming, history television, which is basically all Nazis, all ours. We have even a previous government in Canada using events like the War of 1812 to try and generate kind of a sense of identity. All that was taking place around us, where we as historians were not really part of those discussions very much. And so that's something I think as a profession, at least in Canada, and I suspect my colleagues in other countries would feel the same way, we need to look at reconciling our place as a profession, the kind of future we can offer our students. History graduate enrollments remain quite healthy, but where are those students going to go? How do we better prepare them for a variety of situations? How do we as historians respond to some of the crises that have emerged in Canada? Not only are we dealing with the pandemic, but as probably most people realize, there's for Canadian, a surprising backlash in Canada right now against statues. That was the kind of thing Canadians didn't think we did. Other countries attacked statues. But meanwhile, in Canada, as the discoveries about the residential schools, the bodies that are being identified, the unmarked graves, this is leading to what I see as a discussion in which historians are kind of observing this taking up of history, particularly Canada's imperial past, but in a way that I don't think we were ready for, and I think we're actually quite frankly surprised at the speed with which it's moving. And again, I can't speak for what's happening elsewhere, but it does seem that we're in a time when, as historians, as a profession, we need to be thinking more carefully about that kind of public face, public engagement.
Thank you very much, Douglas. And again, I think those are questions that I'd love us to come back to in discussion. How we engage with that popular interest in history, and to reflect a bit more on some of those political contexts that you called attention to. And it is lovely as well as a sort of side note to hear again some more stories of personal affection from the IHR and personal anecdotes. And so many people have those stories of chance conversations in the common room or at the end of a seminar that really shaped and helped to form their research. And of course, we would love to hear any stories like that you want to share in the chat chat or share them with us on social media and use the hashtag #OurCentury. It's great to hear how the IHR has helped to shape historians' careers. So our final distinguished speaker on our panel is Professor Karen Wolfe, Executive Director of the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, and Professor of History at William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. She's currently finishing a study of the relationship between genealogical practices and political culture for Oxford University Press, and also a short book, Genealogy, for OUP's very short introduction series. I love that series. She contributes regularly to public fora and debates, and Karen visited the IHR in 2019 at the invitation of the then director, Joe Fox. So it's lovely to see you again virtually, Karen. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really lovely to be here and to say, you know, happy birthday, IHR. I love this whole event because I think sometimes, even as we are historians, we fail to be good kind of historians of our own institutions and really take the time to think about what our institutions have achieved. So I absolutely, if I had a cup of something other than a mug of tea, because it's 1 o'clock here, I would be toasting. But happy birthday, IHR. There have been so many rich and important conversations, I think, already generated today in these sessions, and it's really hard to resist joining in some of the themes that have already been raised. But I'm going to try to resist and just make a few points. And partly this comes out of the great joy that I've had in my role at the Omohundro Institute in collaborating particularly with colleagues in the UK at the IHR, through the RHS, and of course through the Georgian Papers program, which has been a wonderful project that the OI has joined in with King's College and the Royal Collection Trust. And I guess the 2 points I want to make is that it strikes me as it's incredibly important to think about what we have in common. And it's also equally important to think about distinctions, both in our institutional practices and in our institutional constraints. So first, let me talk about commonalities, which is to say that I think, as you know, has been raised here and also in some of the earlier sessions, I think it's very clear that historians, professional historians, are deeply committed to history as a public good. That historical practice, whether it is always working in public venues and for public organizations or in an academic context, that history is undertaken for the public good. We do not understand history as some kind of arcane project, even though we also know that history is not always an obviously applied kind of knowledge. We understand the importance of deep basic research, and many of the issues that have come to light in public debate are comprehensible because of decades of research, which at the moment didn't seem like it had immediate application. So I think we are dedicated to the idea of history as a public good, and also to historical truth as a real source of strength for our societies. That is, there's often a discussion about how historical truth can be a negative. That is a strong kind of drumbeat, and I know for sure in the US and in the UK and elsewhere around the world, an insistence that a kind of common narrative, a kind of collective historical understanding, it lies at the kind of foundation of the most equitable societies. And I think historians do not believe that to be the case, that historians believe that a more complex, full, most truthful history is actually a source of deep strength for society. And that, I think, is just important for us to embrace and to understand. I think that we can serve our societies by doing work as historians. Give one quick example here. Recently in the US, we've had a spate of a state-based legislation outlawing or banning the teaching of so-called divisive historical concepts such as race and so on. And the director of the American Historical Association recently co-wrote a wonderful op-ed about how all of that state legislation is essentially cookie cutter legislation. It's all coming out of one kind of shop, one kind of lobbyist shop, and it's all the same language. It's just one thing. That's being a good historian for the public good. That is taking on some of these issues and just using good historical analysis. So I think those commonalities are really important for us to identify and to embrace, especially as things get very difficult for historians and for history. But I also want to point to how significant distinctions are in our practice and our structures. That is that even as the fate of higher education is imperiled around the world, that peril hits differently and it is structured differently. In the UK, where higher education is funded in such a centralized way, things happen very differently than they do in the US, where we have a strong private higher education structures, and we also have state-funded public higher education. So it works out very differently. And I think it's important for us to, I know we all know these things, but I think it's important to surface how these things hit us really differently so we can be both empathetic, but also so that we can learn from and provide support for one another. And that's true too for how our research is financed. It's very different in different national contexts. So I like to always end on commonality, because I think collaboration really is the strength of all of our work. And as I think everyone here has kind of gestured to, but I do think it's important to just recognize distinctions as well. Those distinctions, recognizing and understanding them, actually will strengthen our collaborative spirit. I've certainly always appreciated the opportunity to collaborate with the IHR, and I look forward to much more in year 101 and going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. That's wonderful, and I think your comments there are really helping to get the ball rolling, I think, for our discussion straight away. There's some things that I'd really like to pick up on. I think I'm going to ask a couple of questions myself to start with, but if people have questions that they're thinking of, if you want to start formulating questions and putting those into the chat, or be prepared to raise your hand using the Zoom function in due course, and I'll come to as many people as I can. There's a few questions I'd love to ask. I'd really like to ask us to reflect a little bit more about diversity and inclusion, which are areas that several of you touched on. But I wonder if I could kind of take some of what you were saying there, Karen, as a starting point, and sort of formulate as a question what you said about, how do we as historians serve our societies? And if we could spend a little bit more time thinking about those kind of political contexts and challenges and the kind of climate that we're working in as historians at the moment in Europe, in North America. That's something that Bernhard touched on, others of you touched on as well. So there are challenges, there are some political controversies, hostility, sometimes misuses of history, I think that some of you have observed, that are a difficult context for historians at the moment. I'm thinking particularly in North America of that cover story on Time just a couple of weeks ago, Time magazine, about the so-called history wars, which I think is all part of the kind of context that you're alluding to, Karen. So what do you think, this is a question for all of the panel, are really the big challenges for historians right now in terms of communicating and making the case for what we do, and engaging with those sometimes quite hostile contexts, but also, as Karen has said, kind of engaging positively with the immense popular interest there is in history out there. So, what does the particular context and climate right now mean for what we do? How can we address those challenges and best serve our societies, in Karen's words? Who would like to dive in with some thoughts on that? It was a very baggy question.
It seems wrong to jump in when it was my question at the start, I think, but is it okay to just jump in?
Absolutely, thank you, Karen. Yeah.
Okay, all right, I'm going to go ahead and pick on somebody on Twitter that I just saw earlier today, not by name. Just to say that someone on Twitter said earlier today, we as historians think maybe that everybody is thinking about history all the time, and that so somehow if we give people more and better history, they'll just be thinking with that more and better history. And I wanted to say, no, people are thinking of historically all the time. We know that. People might be thinking in terms of like, I need to go get eggs because I, ate eggs all last week. That's actually thinking historically. We understand how the past informs our present and informs the potential for the future. And people think about that in the broadest of terms, not just in terms of their groceries, all the time. We know that to be true. That's an enormous opportunity for us to clarify that we're not always, when we say thinking historically, we're not always thinking, can you rehearse the particulars of my specialty? We're talking about thinking about how the past informs your current circumstances and the potential and the resources essentially for the next stages for the future.
Yeah, I love that, Karen. More history, more stories. I think it's always a positive, isn't it? There's been a really brilliant project in the UK over the last few years called Colonial Countryside, led by Corinne Fowler at the University of Leicester, who came and spoke to our centre in the IHR recently at one of our seminars. And there's been some resistance to that project in some of the media because it's been telling the often untold stories of the colonial histories and heritage of stately homes and estates in the UK. But more history and better history and deep history is always a really good thing, isn't it? Anyone else on the panel want to comment on? I mean, I think Karen set out for us quite a wide sort of quite a diverse sort of range of different aspects of the current context, from the sort of the higher education funding landscape in different countries through to kind of political contexts. Bernhard, you started at the beginning talking about some of the kind of misuses of history and concerns around that. Does anyone want to come in? Douglas.
Yeah, I think
we'll go to Douglas and then to Bernhard. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah. There's two things that immediately come to mind I would in response. One of which I think one of the challenges in reaching the public is, compared to even 20 years ago, there are just too many channels. I mean, in the past, there was fewer channels, or fewer vectors by which we reached the public, and they were kind of controlled and monitored and regulated in ways that we could, as a profession, turn to our advantage. Coming off of that, and speaking as a kind of a recovering administrator, we have a professional system that really doesn't do justice to historians and efforts at reaching the public. In fact, you're often penalized if if much of your work is aimed at going through public channels and all that, because of the kind of fetishization at times. And again, I don't want to be too dismissive, because peer review, rigorous scholarship is really, really important. But if that's the only thing that we value, and if university administrations are continually obsessed about rankings and ratings, you put the individual scholars, particularly young scholars, in a very difficult situation. If they choose to become publicly engaged, it's very difficult for their institutions to recognize them.
Thank you, Douglas. Yeah, real issues and some comments coming through on that in the chat as well. Thank you, Bernhard.
Yeah, well, I think I mean, I've worked in 4 countries now, and what struck me is that the attitudes that universities have about public engagement are very different. In Germany, there is still very much a sense that if you engage too much in the public, you compromise your scholarly quality. In other countries, it's very, well, in the United States, it can be very difficult to reach a national level because the country is so big and there are so many historians, and there are comparatively few media outlets that will actually let you have a voice. If you work in the Netherlands, because everything is networked together, and many of these people that are in The Hague, in Amsterdam and in Rotterdam actually went to school together, you pick up the phone and you're in the national newspaper. So basically, we just had a PhD student writing about fears of poison gas in interwar in the interwar Netherlands. And he had a double spread in one of the national newspapers about his dissertation, which he finished. So, and whether that's then seen as positive, I think it very much depends. I think then the next issue is, I think, do you operate in a country that has an overall positive public assessment of its national history or not? I mean, I come from a country where the overall public attitude towards our national history is quite critical in light of the Third Reich. And of course, the GDR is also not exactly something that you can be too proud about. So, and that then basically, whereas I mean, in the Netherlands, there is a very relaxed attitude in many ways. This is a country that views itself as liberal, as far more liberal, many people would say, than it actually is. In fact, a country that operates on the myth that it is a guiding country for a long time, a so-called Gidsland. So a model country for others to follow. And that And how this then relates to funding, I don't think that there's a clear correlation. The weird thing about Germany with its complicated history is that there's money galore for funding. I mean, in fact, Germans have problems spending the money that is available for historians. Whereas in a country such as the Netherlands, the funding is really drying up, and it is extremely difficult to get independent PhD projects off the ground. It's virtually impossible by now. So I think also what Karen was saying, I mean, like that there are these differences just with a few European countries. It's very difficult to generalize, I find.
Thank you, Bernhard. I think this is one of the things that's wonderful about these conversations today. You know, hearing more about what's similar in our different contexts, what connects us, but also the differences in the different national contexts we're all working within in terms of our higher education systems, our you know, funding streams and systems, as well as those political contexts as well. Thank you. I wonder if I can move to another question now, which also picks up on something that a few people, a few of you touched on in your opening presentations, and that's thinking about diversity and inclusion. And of course, we're so fortunate to have this wonderful panel of speakers here this evening, a wonderful room of historians and friends of history. But I suppose I want to kind of take a minute and look around and think about who's not here, or who's absent, who's less visible on our platform this evening. Several of you have already touched on these issues, and I wanted to ask, you know, what are your thoughts on what historians can be doing and need to be doing on issues around diversity and inclusion? What can we do over the coming years to ensure that we're opening up participation in our profession? That's a real ambition for the IHR. It's there in our strategy up to 2025 to increase diversity and inclusion in history in all its many facets. So how do we do that? But also related to that, you know, how do we tell more of those stories, do more history, tell the diverse stories, and incorporate that into how we do history? So I would really love to hear some of the panel's thoughts on that. If anyone wants to dive in. Amanda, thank you.
It's a terrific question, and I was thinking about that as Bernhard and Karen were speaking. I would like to see less of a strict division drawn between historians and the public. I mean, first of all, we are ourselves members of the public. We count too as part of the general public. Second of all, I think that, you know, the so-called members of the public have a lot to teach us as well about their own perspective on the past. And as someone who's really engaged in a so-called public-facing project, that seems to imply that the information is going one direction and that the knowledge and the learning is going one direction. It's going from me, the professionally trained historian, out into the public, and I'm not learning anything in that process. Nothing is coming back to me. I'm not listening to the people that I'm speaking with. I'm not gaining any information from them. And I think that that assumption needs to be troubled, because there is a lot in that kind of, as I said before, that multi-directional engagement where people are speaking back and forth to one another. In the US right now, there's a really great phrase which is being used a lot, which is called "not about us, without us." And I think that that's central to any project, historical project, that relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. That if you're going to speak about people who have been excluded, elided, erased, deliberately taken out of the historical record, people who study those histories, who are reflections of those histories, who are the generational inheritors of those histories, they need to be part of the process from the very beginning. You can't build a project about enslaved people, indigenous people, without speaking, you know, with and being and asking for the input and partnering with and collaborating with people who represent those histories today.
Thank you, Amanda. Those are really, really powerful and really important words. Thank you so much for that. And I think that move from public-facing projects to public engagement to true co-production and collaboration that you're describing is so crucial. It's kind of a journey that I've been on in my own career as a historian, and I'm really proud that we've got projects in the IHR that are really doing that, like Layers of London, that is totally co-produced with local communities in London, crowdsourcing history, or even thinking about older projects in new ways. So the Victoria County History, I think of that as a crowdsourced, co-produced project, even though it was founded in 1899, way before those words existed. But, you know, thinking about about what we do in those terms and doing it is so important. I think there's room for us to do so much more, you know, in that spirit. Anyone else want to share any thoughts on diversity and inclusion or doing diverse history? Karen.
Yeah, I really appreciate Amanda's comments, of course. I also just want to go back to something I started with, which is appreciating this birthday celebration as a piece of institutional history. And I think part of kind of acting inclusively is reflecting on the institutional structures that have gotten us to this place, to looking like this, to do the kind of work we do. That is, being good historians of ourselves helps us to understand why it is, in fact, that we have to be so intentional about working inclusively at this point. So I just want to press a word for kind of our reflecting on the history of historical practice and institutions as a piece of that.
That's so helpful, Karen. Thank you. And there's a question in the chat that sort of nuances and expands what we're talking about, I think, from Arif Zaman, calling attention to a significant growth in international business history in recent years. That's not a field that I can claim to have any knowledge of myself, but I think the question might relate to fields that are beyond that, many different areas of history. So the question is, how can developments in different historical fields be leveraged to provide space for more diverse voices and perspectives, whether in terms of geography or gender? So those are just two elements of diversity, aren't they, highlighted there? Geographical diversity, gender diversity. Today, of course, has been thinking all across the globe, and we've got global historians here with us. You know, taking gender or taking global perspectives as a starting point. How do we facilitate greater inclusion of those and involve more of those voices? Would anyone like to come in on that? We've seen some brilliant suggestions, I think, in the events so far today about possible initiatives for connecting, and in our case, the IHR with partners in Asia or in Africa, and kind of setting up longer term partnerships and conferences and collaborations. Perhaps that's one way for us to start connecting with scholars and different perspectives in those regions. Perhaps something for us to think about.
I wonder if we start with, we have this sort of, this is what scholarly academic history is, and then that needs to change. We need to have this engagement, this public history. And I wonder if we think about sort of reaching out to whether it's college or secondary education or whatever, and bringing that in there. I'm just thinking of the role of something like the IHR to bring British scholars out to schools sort of around the world, and then, but also international scholars to British schools and so on. And we all can do that, but it's, you know, teachers, community colleges, or whatever, don't really have, you know, they don't have the time to sort of think about how they would set that up and so on. I think that is a potentially, you know, as we leverage Zoom and so on through things like that, is something sort of for the future, and that is a sort of third level of education and engagement that we're not yet talking about, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Newton. I can see some really enthusiasm for that in the chat. Jeremy is saying that's an incredible, hugely ambitious idea. I love the way that our conversations today are seeding all kinds of ideas and ambitions that you know, maybe we'll think about how we try to take forward in the future. Again, I'd encourage anyone who has a question for the panel for us to open out into discussion. If you want to drop that into the chat, or feel free to raise your hand. And I saw actually Philip Murphy, I think you had your hand raised, so I might turn to you. Philip Murphy is an IHR colleague. He's a professor. He's currently acting director of the IHR, and he's director of the History and Policy Unit based at the IHR that does a lot of what we've just been talking about, actually connecting historians with real world challenges and opportunities and policymakers. So really key to that kind of public history. So Philip, I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and thanks to all our panelists for really wonderful discussion, and it has been throwing up interesting ideas. And I mean, one very quick thought is that we do lack a genuinely sort of global trade union for historians. And maybe we should, we share so many problems, so many challenges, and yet maybe people can think of other examples. So obviously there are organizations that link scholars around the world, but in a sense, we've never had the opportunity before that the internet, or we've never grasped the opportunity that the internet offers us to try and sort of leverage some kind of public space together and discuss our problems. So maybe that is something that we should be thinking about. But a kind of a question going back to Douglas's point, that again, you in the sort of 60s, 70s, and 80s, we had the makings of a genuine public space, a national public space in the media, because you had just 2 or 3 in the UK television channels. And, the South Bank showed quite a kind of a sort of high-powered arts channel show, was on ITV. It was watched by millions of people. But history now, as Douglas was saying, is heavily politicized. But how do we as educators, as communicators, get over the fact that people seem to be now in silos in terms of the channels that they watch, in terms of the people they follow on Twitter or on Facebook? How do we overcome that and try and create a genuine public sphere in which historians can have a voice?
That's a great question, Philip. Thank you. And again, it's bringing us back to that kind of public history and wider engagement, isn't it? And I've heard lots of different metaphors for that: silos, echo chambers, bubbles, confirmation bias. How do we communicate? I'd be really interested to hear about any experiences that our panelists have of communicating in kind of creative or innovative, imaginative ways to try and get beyond that. How do we communicate beyond those silos? Newton, you look like you're unmuted. Is that because you're going to dive in, or am I picking on you unfairly?
Sorry.
Okay. It's a really tricky question. It's a great question, Philip, but it's a difficult one. Bernhard, thank you.
Maybe I want to historicize Philip's question. I'm wondering whether we are not now seeing these silos more, and whether they didn't exist beforehand, but they were just simply not quite as visible. And people were basically in their own communicative networks. I mean, like the German oral historian Lutz Niethammer, he speaks of public memory and communicative memory. And communicative memory is the private memory that can be activated and can become public memory, but usually doesn't get there. And what we now have with the social media is that it all becomes visible. And of course, what the social media then does, it has a reinforcing effect. It makes sort of like it may well make the boundaries much more firm. But I'm not so sure that the 80s or the days of the limited number of television channels were necessarily quite as cohesive as maybe implicit in your question.
That's really nice, Bernard. Thank you. And thank you for the historicizing answer. Very, very welcome this evening. I just want to say that I'm aware actually that Bernhard needs to leave us by 7 o'clock. So if I don't get an opportunity after now, Bernhard, I'd like to thank you very much for all your wonderful insights and reflections this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I think in the IHR, I've had the opportunity to work with some amazing projects that have some great imaginative communication strategies. We worked last year with the Museum of Youth Culture, who meet people where they are in shopping centres, or they've run scanning socials where they've scanned people's photographs of historic youth cultures at local clubs or places where communities actually are. And I think one of the things I've really felt over this last year with this move to online is it's much harder to kind of meet people where they are online, because we are kind of perhaps more trapped in our silos, and it's a little bit harder to go to those kind of community spaces that we're not familiar with and make contacts there. So maybe that's another challenge of being online. Maybe there are upsides to that as well. I'm not sure. Karen.
So two quick contrasts. I think we're all aware of the incredible value of being online. I've seen in the chat some people commenting on how great it is, and Amanda, of course, talked about this too, how great it is to be able to go to all these seminars. I love this. I feel like I'm at a seminar just about every day, sometimes while I'm making dinner. But you know, it's so great. All this online activity is great. But at the same time, we wonder, how will we replicate some of the in-person value of connecting? And that's true for how we think about our kind of lives in the public as well. So I just wanted to quickly contrast two programs at the Omohundro Institute, which really I have been wrestling with around this particular dynamic. One is a book club that I started for a local group of retirees, about 12 people. And we read, and this has been for about 4 years now, and we read history, hard history, lots of footnotes. We've had some great conversations, and really revealing conversations about what history is and how people want to read historical evidence and think about not just the past, but also think about how historians digest information. And then the other would be the fact that the Omohundro Institute's public programs have quadrupled in attendance this year because of our virtual capacity. So, you know, we, like everybody else, can have many, many hundreds of people attending. And I really think there's value in both, because I think there was really a value in those close local community connections. I learned a lot about these people, and I think they learned a lot about themselves and about, you know, we just really came together in a way that it's been really just, it's really valuable to me, that local group, but also just loved people being able to come from all over the world to attend events. So I think there's a kind of both and quality to how we're thinking about, you know, in engagement, and also how we're thinking about exactly that dynamic that Amanda mentioned, which is the fact that the street goes both ways, you know, or it doesn't even go both. It's like all over the place, right? We're all together learning from one another. And I certainly feel that in that little book club, I am for sure learning from those folks.
Oh, I love that case study. And I'm definitely taking away a kind of both more and yes as kind of takeaways from this evening's conversation, which I think is really great and really energizing. There's some really brilliant comments in the chat. Mia has shared some brilliant comments on the kind of dual real world and virtual approaches to engagement. So the example of the Migration Museum in Lewisham Shopping Centre is a really wonderful mode of engagement, but then historians on TikTok, and I know some historians are on TikTok doing amazing things. I'm totally there for historians on TikTok. That's absolutely brilliant. And you know, some important comment from Arif Salman on the really crucial need to do better in terms of telling stories of Black British history and focusing on that in historical scholarship here in the UK, certainly. There's a question here from Peter Stansky in the chat, which kind of brings us back to research itself, and Karen's addressing that in the chat. So is there a danger while we rightly emphasize the importance of engagement or outreach or external collaboration, not paying enough attention to the essential nature of basic research, which is at the heart of our work as historians? And I think we've had some answers so far that have kind of maybe urged us to kind of think more capaciously about what we might think of as research, and kind of enlarge our understanding of that, which I really love. But I'd be really interested in any reflections on Peter's question. I wonder if I could be a little bit cheeky, Peter, I hope you don't mind this, slightly kind of conflate it with another question, because I'd love to talk about research a little bit. And so Peter's question brings us back to that, which I think is so important, as he says. But I'd love to ask you to do a little bit of, I suppose, it's sort of horizon scanning. You know, what do you think are the really exciting areas that we're going to be researching as historians over the coming years? You know, if you've got your ear to the ground, what do you think are the emergent, important, lively, vibrant topics that you see becoming the next turn, the next area of big interest for historical researchers? Or I suppose also, what do you think we should be researching? What do we need to be researching that maybe we're not doing enough of? So Peter's turning us back to research, and any thoughts around the importance of our research and what we might be doing over the coming years. I realise I'm hedging my bets quite a lot on my questions this evening, kind of 6 questions for the price of 1 with each of these. Douglas?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm assuming probably all of us, or nearly all of us here, believe in basic research. It's what drove us and what inspires our passion. The question might be more, how do we then take that passion, communicate to others, starting maybe more narrowly with our own people in our field, and then branching out outwards. Maybe some of us might want to push it out in the public and that. But the question that comes back to me, I'm not sure whether we as a community, not simply as historians, but as basically beneficiaries of a very elite educational systems. Let's be honest with ourselves. We've never really thought about how we articulate why that research is important. We do it to one another in language we each understand, but we haven't really learned how to take it beyond that. And I think that's maybe something which we need to be spending more time on. Is it, if we're going to engage with the public, part of it is explaining and getting them excited about what we do.
Thank you very much, Douglas. And I wonder whether actually part of the answer to those questions about what our research is and the importance of research and what kind of research we might be doing over the coming years, perhaps part of that answer is what we've all been saying about kind of co-production and engaged research and collaboration. Maybe what's going to characterize the work we do as historians in the coming years, maybe the turn won't be so much around a particular topic, but maybe it will be around new modes and methodologies. So co-production, creative practice, digital approaches, AR and research, and lots of the things that you've all highlighted already in your presentations. I think it's an exciting moment for that kind of history laboratory that we are at the IHR, and of course that we're all part of. We're all doing that experimental, innovative work as historians. Okay, well, I think I will move on to the next part of this evening's programme. Thank you so much to all our panellists for some really stimulating thoughts. There's lots that I'll be taking away, lots of inspiration actually, as well as challenge. I've particularly welcomed the kind of the attention to sort of the ethics and the purpose of what we do in our conversation this evening. And I particularly value some of the comments and experiences and case studies we've seen shared in the chat that give us further resources and tools for thinking through how we can do some of that. Some of what we do as public historians, and in terms of developing greater inclusion and diversity, how we can do that better. So that's really, really valuable. So I'm going to move on now to our last video message of the day. Please stick around, because after this video message, another quick trailer. As I said, delighted that we're going to hear from Professor Claire Langemer, our incoming new director of the IHR. But our last video message of the day is from our brilliant IHR Centenary patron, Shahid Abari, who works in quite a different sort of discipline in a way. She's at University of the Arts, London, and she's a brilliant kind of public speaker for the humanities. Gemma, do feel free to set the video up. A brilliant public advocate for the humanities, very closely involved in BBC Radio and other media work.
Hello, I'm Shahid Abari. I'm Professor of Fashion Cultures and Histories at the University of the Arts, London, and I'm so pleased to be able to say happy birthday to the Institute of Historical Research. It's a really wonderful thing to celebrate the centenary of an institution like this, one that's been a hub for innovative research. I've always thought of the IHR's home, Senate House, as a lighthouse, a beacon in Bloomsbury, signalling commitment to scholarship and reflection and critical thought. And as a graduate student in the early noughties, I really remember it as a home to a community of researchers who were astonishingly wide-ranging in their interests. I remember it as a place of proper intellectual companionship, which I know it will continue to be over the next 100 years too. It feels especially powerful, I think, to celebrate history as a discipline this year in what is a historic moment, a global pandemic which has affected every aspect of our lives. And it's also prompted us to reflect on who we are as a community and what our shared values might be. It seems to me that one of the ways we discover that is through the storytelling of shared histories. family histories, local histories, intellectual histories, national histories, and increasingly global histories. And this centenary comes in the midst of a really intense period of critical reflection about history, its role in nation building and self-making. And it seems to me our crucial questions right now are about how we tell our histories better and more fully and truthfully, asking whose history is being told and at whose expense. These are really difficult and ongoing conversations, not always easy to answer. But by asking them, we're reshaping our sense of who we mean by we, and we are opening up the borders of history and recognising the powerfully global contexts in which we exist. So there are challenges ahead. We need to create a culture of critical history and prove the value of historical thinking in a political climate that has sometimes dismissed expertise. We need to learn how to better disseminate historical research, but that's something that the IHR has always been terrifically good at. And these are exciting challenges, opportunities to know ourselves and each other better. And to my mind, it's entirely reassuring to know that the IHR has been here for 100 years and hopefully will be for another 100 years, leading the way.
A lovely message from Shahidha. Thank you so much, Shahidha, for that birthday message, and some reflections I thought in her birthday message that really resonate with so much of what we've been talking about together this evening, which is great. So we're coming to the end of this evening's programme and the end of our birthday, but of course our centenary activities continue all year, and you can find on the IHR website there's a wonderful programme. We're talking about co-production and collaboration. There's a wonderful programme of centenary events taking place right across the UK, working with local partners and communities and history in so many different forms. But right now, it is a real delight to be able to introduce Professor Claire Langemer, who's just been appointed as the new director of the Institute of Historical Research, and she's going to be joining the IHR in October. Claire is Professor of Modern British History at the University of Sussex, where she's previously been head of department. She's also a trustee of the Mass Observation Archive, and her research examines the feelings and experiences of ordinary people in 20th century Britain. I know Claire is passionate about advocating for history today and into the future, and she's really deeply committed to diversity, inclusion and collaboration in everything we do. I've heard her speak about that before. I'm really looking forward to working with Claire at the IHR, and it just feels such a lovely opportunity, Claire, to welcome you today and to be thinking about the future of the IHR as we celebrate our centenary and our birthday. So I'm going to hand over to Claire for some closing words as we celebrate the IHR centenary. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everybody for what has been a really, really lovely session to sit in on. And actually that image of Senate House as a lighthouse will really stay with me. There's a real power to that. I really love that. It is, of course, the honour of my working life to have been appointed to this position, to have the opportunity to guide the future of an organisation that has such a rich and compelling history, but also to work with a team who've done so much to cohere and support historians before and during the global pandemic. And I'm just really, really looking forward to working with you all over the next 5 years. The Institute, of course, has a wide and vital remit to advocate for history in all of its diverse forms, and to advocate for historians wherever they are located. Fundamentally, I think the Institute offers historians a home, a virtual home now, as well as a physical home. And it is a home with some exemplary values, such as curiosity, integrity, inclusivity, collaboration, but also care and equality. The sense of the Institute as a home and the feelings of genuine affection that follow from this struck me forcibly in the messages I received since my appointment was made public. Becoming director of the IHR is a huge responsibility because of its history, because of its possibilities, and because of the attachment that historians have to it. And that attachment has come out so beautifully in this session. It is a daunting task, and it should be a daunting task. It's also, I think, a uniquely lovely job. The very many messages of congratulation that I've received are an important reminder to me that it is a role that matters and is seen to matter. I'm also acutely aware that I follow in the footsteps of some really outstanding former directors, including David Cannadine, of course, who spoke earlier, as well as Joe Fox, who opened the day, and the acting director, Philip Murphy. The fact that I will have Albert Pollard's own desk in my office will be a daily reminder, both of that lineage, but also of Pollard's still provoking and already quoted this evening ambition that the Institute should be a historical laboratory. Of course, history faces, as others have also noted today, real challenges, and is the subject of powerful critique and sometimes active hostility. Some of this is deserved. I mean, we must work with it to extend the community of historical practice, to expand our foci, and to think imaginatively about our approaches. History has not always included all pasts, and its institutions are not yet as diverse as they need to be. We must engage with these critiques openly and reflexively, but with an underlying confidence about our intellectual and social purpose. But we also need to defend history from those who would like to flatten or even to erase its complexity. And we need to challenge those who view it as the preserve of an elite. As Douglas suggested, history remains hugely popular, particularly beyond the university. It is in many ways now quite ordinary in its ubiquity, and we need to harness and work with this ordinariness in sustainable and generative ways. So over the second century of the IHR, we will drive an energetic conversation about what history is now, about how it is done, who gets to do it, and why it matters. And we'll do this by challenging borders and promoting openness. We will draw together academics across the UK and across the globe, but we will also talk with the writers of historical fiction, the makers of documentaries, with family historians, community history groups, and those who seek to make history popular in all sorts of other ways. We'll talk with archivists, with curators, with policymakers, and with educationalists, school children, and with our own students. We will bring all of these historians, all of these different publics, a public and publics, which has rightly been pointed out, we are part of, we are not separate from, we'll bring them into the same playful, creative and experimental community. Still very much a historical laboratory, and we will ask them and we will ask ourselves how we might best work together to champion the value of history, to assert the importance of history, and to assure the future of historical research. So with that, I just want to say happy birthday to the IHR. I think the next century is going to be really exciting. It's going to be really challenging, but that challenge is itself quite invigorating. And I look forward to working with the Institute. I'm going to hand back now to Catherine. Who's going
to... Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you. That was such an inspiring kind of call to action for the next 100 years, I guess, of the IHR. Really, really wonderful. And the idea of being part of, the words you used, a playful, creative, experimental history community. I'm totally on board for that, and I'm sure many of us here are. What an exciting prospect in all of what we do as historians. So thank you. So now I'd just like to invite everyone, if you're not already, to keep in touch with the IHR and to please continue sharing these conversations. Do take them to social media if you'd like to, using our hashtag Our Century, and continue those conversations with those who weren't here at our event today. Do explore our programme of centenary events that's on the IHR website, events across the UK, but many of them accessible online as well. I'd also like to say some thank yous to people who've made this event and the whole day possible. So first of all, thank you again to our amazing panelists and speaker, Claire Langemer. Really energizing conversation, inspiring and challenging in equal measure. So thank you so much. I'll be taking loads away from that. I'd also like to thank my colleague Gemma Dormer, who's just a very kind of discreet presence here this evening, but she's the SAS engagement manager and has been managing many of these IHR centenary events, including today. And it's thanks to her that this has run so brilliantly and smoothly. And of course, to my colleague Annette Bullen, who again has been a very discreet and modest presence here this evening. But many of these IHR centenary celebrations are really her brainchild. She's leading our IHR centenary campaign. So thank you, Annette, for making this possible and getting this off the ground. Thank you so much to everyone who's shared in the chat, who's joined us, who's helped us to celebrate. It's been lovely to see you. Stay in touch.